Welcome to Impact Farming, where we introduce you to the people and ideas that will have a massive impact on your farming operation. Brought to you by Farm Marketer. Sit down, start the engine, and let's roll with today's show.
You silence the doubters. You get the best tools. You work with the right people. You look to the future and bust through.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Impact Farming Show. Today we have Annessa Good and Merle Good joining us for part 2 of a 2-part episode we're doing together on transition planning as the main umbrella, succession, and then wealth transfer. So if you guys did not catch part 1, go there. There was so much good stuff in there, and we covered succession, the pillar of succession. And now today in the episode, we're going to dive right into wealth transfer. So if you missed it, just stop right now. Go check the other one. You don't want to miss it. So we're going to pick up real quick here and just hit the road running. Why don't we dive right into fiscal reality under our estate planning episode? Who wants to start on that one?
Let you take. Oh, okay. For sure. I was gonna say, I'll let you do your. I'll still, Dad. You take the first lead, just from a parent's perspective, and then I'll dive in a bit.
Well, on the wealth transfer side, what I want to make sure people understand is that in prairie agriculture, our wealth is our land, of course, right? That's the big elephant in the room. And if land was worth what it was in 1971, which in my area was $145 an acre in 1971, no one would have any issues. So what kind of a humor thing, because this is a podcast, when I first started doing understanding the business, which is succession versus estate planning, is not will planning. Estate planning is redeeming your equity while you're alive. That's what I like to look at it. And so put it kind of in a context before we get into details, is because agriculture is equity-based, if mom and dad own all the equity until they die and transfer the assets, whether it's corporate shares, partnership interest, assets, what happens is it creates tremendous stress and problems of understanding and communication, because it means that mom and dad gave me the farm when they died. The second generation is going to say, hold it. I put in 35 years here working together. Why is this transfer happening on death? It also puts tremendous stress on the parents, and this is a concept I want parents to understand, so I'm going to do a little bit more colloquialism here rather than details. If you hold the assets until your death, what happens is you die with a lot of wealth, correct? And so the question is, that's where the other non-farm children look at it and say, gee, when mom and dad died, they transferred $7 million. Where that if we take the idea that parents will live off their equity and slowly have that's why we like companies, and that's why we'll go through that a little bit. What I'm trying to get across to the next generation is they have to live off equity so that necessarily they don't have 7 million when they die. Maybe they only have 3.5 million when they die. So we'll go through some of that about how to do that most effective way. But the main thing what I want to get across on all these things is that do something when you're alive. Because what that joy is, if I transfer land to Annessa when we're alive, she has to make sure she doesn't screw up when I give it to her or sell it to her. But at the same token, when we're all done, I want to see the enjoyment of her taking that ownership on and progressing rather than waiting patiently until I croak.
Yeah. It's a much nicer way to do it, right? It's a little bit more of a legacy versus okay, I'm dead, I don't care anymore. Right?
Exactly. So that's what we're trying to get across. And there's some economics and some tax in there, but all that Nessa. So that's kind of the background of estate planning is transferring. My job as an estate planner is to take your will and bring it alive. That's what I tell people, is to take a death will and bring it alive and enact it prior to death.
Interesting. Great way to explain it.
Okay,
and,
so
matching that up, tying back to the first episode, because they do go hand in hand, tying that up to those expectations and those timelines, and what that works to earn it and to be there alongside that. And so that's why, Tracy, you know, we always say when we have families come in and they want to write that emergency will, right? That, you know, just in case the unthinkable happened, you have to write it as if it's read tomorrow. Because that's where I notice the psychological logjam is they're trying to write the will when they're 80 years old and how this will all look, right? And they're coming in to me in their 50s and 60s, and I'm saying we have to write that as if it's tomorrow. And then based on that transfer of ownership and management to the farming generation, of course, we will constantly have to be updating our wills as we go along. So I had a customer say it to me the other day, and I loved how he said it. He's like, so you're telling me a will is a living document? Well, ain't that ironic? I was like, yeah, it kind of is.
Good point.
So, yeah.
That is a neat way to look at it, Annessa. I even tripped myself up when I was doing my will planning. I'm like, okay, well, when I'm right, and I'm trying to think of what's going to be happening in 40 years from now. Like, how do you plan for that?
Especially when you have children's ages.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I think it's for sure. So that's why, you know, when we start to even have this emergency will conversation, the first thing we kind of do slow down is saying, okay, what is our fiscal reality? Because a lot of wills are out there that, you know, are kind of the dream boat will. And if they ever did come through, would absolutely have negative ramifications that the parents did not want to leave with that legacy, right? So, you know, the first thing we just slow down is how many hands are in the pot, whether it's the emergency will or if it's the will that we're writing when you are in your later years. Mom and dad, what are you pulling today as a living wage? And then what's your estate plan for your off-farm children? So their hands are now in the pot too. Then you have the junior generation that's taking over the farm, and the decisions you make with your wealth transfers greatly affects the future of my business. So the only time I cry, Tracy, leaving consults and driving home is when I have had to sit across from a 45, 50-year-old man and wife and tell them that if the parents' will does come true, they no longer have a viable business. And they're far too long to backpedal for any other directions, right? So that's why having these conversations conceptually, Dad will speak to that more. Both Dad and I differ from quite a few other advisors that say have 100% transparency from day one. But conceptually, you know, we have to look at our fiscal reality. And Dad spoke about living off equity from the seniors perspective, but I'm going to bring in, I think what I focus on a lot is the junior generation and how can I also live off equity or have earned that equity in my off-farm siblings' eyes when they challenge it. So a formula that Dad came up with a long time ago, I think it's older than me, but that we've certainly played around with together a lot in our consulting it's called the value formula. And we've all heard of good old-fashioned sweat equity, right? Mm-hmm. But what's caused so much hurt in our agriculture culture is that we haven't properly tracked it, right? So going back exactly, Tracy, to podcast episode 1, like we have to start to bring in some formal tracking and documentation. It's kind of reverse psychology. I have parents say to me, if I want to put all this down in writing, it feels like I don't trust my kids. And I'm saying we're putting all of this in writing, you know, unanimous shareholders agreement that the accountants make us do to protect the business. These documents are to protect the family because we want that protected. So the value formula, there's a couple different versions, but it's saying, okay, we know that the farm can't afford to pay the junior generation what they're actually worth. You know, above and beyond their labor, such as taking extra courses, listening to these educational things, for etc. So how do we bump that up? We always say, well, sweat equity, right? Then if we do wait and the off-farm kids come back and challenge that and say, what do you mean they're getting the farm? Well, because he was the farm kid or daughter all those years. So the sweat equity formula is just saying, okay, it's your wage plus perks if your family wants to track that. So, you know, getting to live in the farmhouse for less than full market rent, things like that. But the critical part is plus your sweat equity. Okay. So if I'm worth $80,000 a year, but the farm can only afford to pay me $40,000, how do I feel like I'm valued? Okay, we're tracking $40,000 a year and then it'll go up to match the expectations and the timelines. But that's a visual in the equity Bible that the children can refer back to and the off-farm siblings can refer back to. And then whenever I cash in as the farm kid, be it, credit towards future land ownership. So yeah, mom and dad, you didn't give me 50% off. I actually earned 50% off, right? Credit towards cattle, equipment, whatever it may be. And, I'm doing this example pretty fast. We usually spend a lot more time on it and the technicalities, but just getting the concept of how do we empower the junior generation and also have a formal, proof for any challenges in the future.
That is a great idea. I love it.
So my next question, I'll let Dad speak to it for sure, is, my angst or my stress as a junior generation is, okay, mom and dad, retirement income has to be a part of your estate planning too. So I'll let Dad speak to the retirement income from his perspective.
So if you go back to my idea of the three bubbles, what's interesting, when parents take money out of the business, there's not been an active farm child ever in my career, unless they're really under financial stress, that cares how much money mom and dad take out to live. But, here's the but. What they don't want the parents to do is take money out to buy stocks in the stock market so they can live that wealth to the sister.
Oh.
So when you come back to about living, the question boils down, yeah, I don't mind taking them out to live, Dad and Mom, but what are you doing? You're taking out more than I think you need to do for investing, and then hopefully eventually that investing will provide you a living. Where parents come back to me, and there's very seldom, if they have a $500,000 stock portfolio, investments, RSPs, tax-free savings accounts, they're always keeping that pot, trying to say that is going to go to the non-farm family, correct? Members. So that's cash. That's the old traditional way of doing it. Cash goes to the non-farm, wealth goes to the farming business, correct? Which is still very much in play. However, what happens is, so then when we get to retirement age, what happens is because of the capital requirements and the size and scope of farming, the farm business, quote unquote, would say, hey, Dad and Mom, you got a $600,000 in the market. It's puking out dividends of 3% right day in the Canadian market. Why aren't you taking those dividends and living off them so you're pulling less money out of the farm? Correct? So this whole idea of retirement income, it's not really, that's why we put it in the estate planning side, is because there's no issue about mom and dad living off of their income to live, because most of these parents I work with aren't big spenders, right? But it's the fact they're drawing money out of the business to try to create a larger off-farm investment pot to leave to the non-farm children. So kind of jumping ahead, what I say to people is, you're better off to leave some land to your non-farm children, and we'll get to how this is going to work. So put it in perspective. As a farm business, mom and dad, in order and give me the chance to grow the business, not my wealth, but grow the farming, the tractors, the machinery, the inventory, rent more land, how about I'll agree that some land will go to my off-farm siblings worth $1 million or more. So in return for that, you won't try to make the off-farm pot very large. Because if you try to make the off-farm part really large for the off-farm children, well, of course, you diminish the earnings of the business. So what I say to the whiny farm children, I'm saying you can't suck and blow. You can't want all the land to go to you and then turn around and bitch that mom and dad are taking money out of the business to grow the off-farm bubble to leave to them, right? And so when we have this little conversation, I'm saying, I'm jumping ahead, Ness, I know, but just to get the context. The context is, I'd rather, and this is what I'm going to come up with, I'd rather have my sister or my brother be landlords that I rent from them than have them own shares in my operating business, or have mom and dad strip the operating business with cash to give to them in the ultimate will. Because probably in our province, same as yours, roughly 40% of the cultivated land in Alberta is rented. So all I'm trying to get across is, in my concept here, kind of a colloquialism conversation, is having your siblings as landlords isn't necessarily the worst thing in hell, right? As long as we have proper structures to it. So that's kind of my lead in about, fiscal reality is part of that part, is saying, don't drain the business to create fairness.
Yes.
Use wealth to create fairness.
Okay, interesting.
Goes into those divisions of a viable business that you're saying to the junior generation. Like you said, Tracy, coming in with the debt, the risk, right? All of these things, and then the wealth. And we'll definitely jump in, but I will be that whiny farm kid because that's kind of my, perspective to bring to the table and being there. And, it is turning around and saying, a lot of families I work with, they say we can't keep buying this land again and again in our own family, right? Like there will be no capability for expansion and things like that to remain competitive. And so one of the challenges that I saw early on in my career that still baffles me to this day is, we talk about values and what's our mission and what's our core to our family. And that's, on the farming side, but then how do we have different values and missions for our off-farm children? And so what I mean by that is, in our community, especially if parents were to gift or transfer land at less than fair market value to the supposed farmer successor, and they got out one day and sold to the neighbors, they'd be like the gossip of the community for months, right? Like, how could they do this? It's the legacy, it's the family farm. If the off-farm children sell it the next day, they're smart investors. I'm like, it's the same land, it's the same family. So to challenge that, when Dad and I were together a bit, because I was definitely getting frustrated with, that the farming child is expected to buy the farm in whatever capacity that looks like off mom and dad to support their living and or estate plan. But my sister just gets to inherit $1 million quarter at Cremona and there's no ties or no rules. Like, how is this fair if we want to have the discussion of fair versus equal? And so we kind of, very high level, but, we're kind of bringing it up to challenge the culture, and it doesn't always land well with parents, but it strikes conversation is there that same expectation then that off-farm children contribute to that resource that they are to inherit? So to take less pressure off the business, Dad and I worked on a client case together, and, instead of having a TFSA for this family, we said to the daughter and her husband, you will pay the parents $12,000 a year, like your match of $6,000 each. And when we did the math and we played it all out just for example numbers in our area, she would get a 500% return on her money, right? It's pretty good return on your money. So just that culture shift of, if we're trying to make our children fair, not equal, but fair, then also the same playing rules have to apply potentially. So it's been a fun one.
Yeah, so to kind of bring that back a little bit, that's pretty fast, Ness, and get us on the it boils down to, it's a terminology we kicked around. It's a new concept. It's called proportionality. If I'm going to inherit $5 million as the farming child in the current will, correct, and my sisters are going to inherit $1.5 million. If we look at that, and that's going to be kind of the rough the change. So, what the question is, should they not have to buy part of their inheritance early, same as I am? And of course, it's a concept, right? And because what's really interesting when you bring that concept up, and this was an idea of mine, came up on a small farm, Tracy. It was a half-section guy who had a very small farm, cow-calf operation, rented his land out, and he couldn't live off the rent. So I went back to the girls. There's no active success, right? I said to the girls, why don't you guys invest your tax-free savings account into buying land off your parents so they can have a decent retirement? And the one girl said, well, no, we can't afford that. I mean, we got kids to put to school and all these things about living costs. I'm going, well, so does the farmers. But anyways, at the end of the day, what I'm trying to get back was that I think parents have to look at that. If they do not have enough cash flow, then perhaps they have to look at proportionality of wealth in the will to fund the retirement income of the parents. You won't see this in large grain operations, but I am seeing this a little bit, and I call it the 4-H curse.
Okay.
The 4-H curse is where a bunch of kids grew up on a smaller farm with cattle. They all love cattle. They all want to be home to take care of the cattle, and there's not enough income for one family, let alone setting up 3 boys that all want to own cows, right? And so that is where I sometimes go back into sector analysis, and I am fearful for the livestock sector being transferred to the next generation. because of the scale and scope it takes to gross $1 million. Like that's kind of like an average grain farm in most commercial operations, between 600,000 up to $1 million, then over $1 million. Well, you know how many cow-calf units you have to gross $1 million? I mean, it's tough out there. And so that's why I'm thinking in a smaller livestock-based industries, which is a lot in Manitoba, up in the Interlake area. I did some work up there. That's where we have to start looking at different ideas.
Yeah, I agree. And some of those conversations aren't even had enough when kids come back to the farm. I've seen like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, 2 children trying to come back to a 250 head beef farm. Wait a minute. And support 3 families. I know some pretty good numbers, and those don't jive. There's a reason you guys are having a hard time, right?
Yeah, and so in our discussions sometimes, just to get Nessa will talk on this, is sometimes in those realities, this fiscal reality we're talking about in estate planning, it's called rural. What did you come up with, Nessa? Rural lifestyle, or what was that terminology?
Yeah.
Go ahead, explain that. I think that's important.
Certainly we see it more where our family farm is, because the Cochrane and Airdrie and stuff, it's getting so much more that acreage, and Dad says 4-H curse, but living and breathing it for sure. And so it is that conversation of saying the levels of, if you want to put a title on it, but you can still be a farmer or be involved in the industry, be passionate, be an advocate. But my question is, when did it just become accepted again that there's no off-farm income? Like, that is very surprising to me. And again, even a culture shift of, honestly, since I even came back to the 4 or 5 years ago with Dad, of now the spouses no longer have off-farm income. It's just expected that they're at home raising the kids and stuff like that, or the husbands are also home supporting the farm if the wife is the main farm child. And so it's kind of coming back to that economic reality of, 100%. When did that shift occur? And, we can have 2 siblings come home for sure, but that gets back to critical tracking. And it takes 2 things to run a business: time and money. If I'm not going to be there as much physically present because I do have an off-farm job, then, am I supporting a little bit more on the financial side, or vice versa? Something I'm seeing in my work, which has actually been very interesting with COVID, we saw it huge when oil crashed here in Alberta, was, as parents, do we have a timeline of when siblings can come home to the operation? So I don't want to be constantly looking over my shoulder thinking that I'm the farm child, but one of my siblings can come home. And, stereotypically, we thought everyone had their lives figured out by age 30. Oil and gas crashed that for us. Lots of 45, 50-year-old men coming back saying they wanted in. And, talking to my colleagues with COVID and stuff, they're already seeing that a bit in Ontario too. We don't want to live in the city anymore. We want to come back and have this option as a career. So a little scary if you're the farm kid that's been home for a significant amount of time.
Well, and I mean, that's not really fair to anybody. I mean, dollars are dollars, right? I have always come from our farm operation from a corporate standpoint. I have a budget. I know the income that comes in roughly every year, and I know the expenses that come in. If I look to hire somebody, bring somebody into my operation, that is a budgeted line item, and we need to see what's going to compensate at the top, right? So I've always said this is a very business decision. If somebody's popping back up on the farm, well, wait a minute, where are you getting paid from? What are you doing, right? Anyways.
But then you have your heart, right? And I'm sitting across from these parents saying, what am I supposed to do too? So the same thing happens, if we see a significant age gap between children, that same conversation comes up. Why should just the oldest have an opportunity and things like that? So again, coming back to, we kind of talk in our consulting an age. So it's no limitations or anything, just saying by this age, every sibling had a chance to assess if they wanted to come back. And we go from there. Yeah,
that's a legit point. It's not a just open door that is a legit point that should be made. I didn't even think of that. I mean, that could be just a knock from left field, right? When you're on a career path in a position, I mean, stuff can happen, but you know where you're going, you know your income, you know what life's about.
100%.
You silence the doubters. You get the best tools. You work with the right people. You look to the future and bust through.
And again, I hate to go corporate because, of course, my audience is Tracy. We're farmers, but same concept. I like comparing it because we're not so different. We're farm businesses, corporate businesses. Let's use a little bit of that thinking here too, right? Anyways, my tangent. Carry on.
No.
Yeah, so I think we'll move past the fiscal reality because agriculture has been well rewarded in the last 20 years. And it's kind of funny, if you watch the economics, it took off in 2002, and it's been going ever since then. And so it's not doom and gloom as much as we say here. And one of the things I was trying to cue up was on the smaller cattle guys coming back, and either other children that want to come back. What we've decided in a lot of my clients is create rural lifestyles for the other children, not necessarily rural businesses. So that's why I thought Annessa would pick up on that, is where I'm saying to girls that I call it the 4-H curse because they all want to come back to the farm or have their livestock. I'm saying, hey, there's nothing wrong with this. We're just kind of giving an indication how we work this. If I'm giving the one child because he was there first, and just the way life is, and life's not fair. It's what happens happens. But if I'm going to transfer the business, like I talked about earlier, all the equipment, all the cattle, if I die, whatever. What I sometimes do, just to give people an explanation of how to make this work, is in that gift, there's an expectation that the child who gets the machinery or the cattle machinery or whatever will, if my daughter gets a quarter section in the will because of a wealth transfer, to run her cows on it, her brother will do the custom work at 50% of fair market value for 15 years. That's in the will. In other words, I will transfer that on the condition you do this for so many years to give that support back to your sister, create a rural lifestyle so she can have her kids grow up in a rural area. The reason I'm bringing this up is the Interlake area in Manitoba, where I saw a lot of small farms a few years ago, kind of like Cremona, where we had small cattle operations years ago. Now we're not that way anymore. I just want to make sure we have that kind of discussion with that part of the audience, not just all the grain farmers that are grossing $1 million, is to have that conversation of rural lifestyles, but then have custom work part of the contract so you don't have to buy your own machinery.
Okay. And I guess, that's a hard part with this show. We're talking to farmers across Canada, different types of farms and different types or different sizes, different numbers of siblings, farms that are paid off versus new farms. Like, it's so hard to even sit here, and that's where the advisors come in, right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So I think we're going to change gears a little bit, Trace, and I think we're going to talk about in the estate planning is do something when you're alive, right? Annessa talked about a will being a live document. So one of the things I want to focus on right now, which maybe we kind of threw at you here a little bit differently, is transferring land while you're alive. We didn't really necessarily give that to you as a prompt, but I want to go down that path a little bit, and I want to do an example. Then Nessa's going to talk about the 5 Ds when we do it together. So when I go to parents and say, try to transfer something when you're alive, not just on death, to give clarity of ownership besides just the operating business. Mm-hmm. And so it's very simple. I go to parents and say, when it comes to land, there's 2 rules. One, you're dying with land. And one of your podcasts, Art Lang, talked about that as well, that parents have to own land until they die. That's rule number 1. You are going to die with land. Don't expect to have every acre transferred before we croak, because it ain't happening, because that's the ultimate security blanket. So once I say that, mom goes, oh, thank you, right? Yeah. Because dads are all built about trying to transfer a business, and moms are usually not being sexist, but are trying to save the family if necessary. So to make a long story short, parents will die with land. So instead of saying, oh, you'll die with all of it, what I'm trying to do is transfer some of it while they're alive, right? Rather than waiting until they're dead. So we got different examples, can't do it today, but just to give it kind of an idea, this might help a lot of the older farmers. I had a client that rented 5 quarters off his debt for the last 10 years, okay? So $50 an acre, $60 an acre, which is roughly half price for our area. Well, of course, that's stupid. Absolutely stupid. I'll tell you why from a tax perspective. Mom and dad got the rent. They paid 35% tax rate on it. The son's got a company. His tax rate's 11, same as in Manitoba. Ontario's, I think, 11.5. So in other words, the company's saving 11% on the rent, and mom and dad are paying 35, so 22 points are going to Ottawa, right? So why would you do that? So what I'm trying to come back with, even that kind of a deal, in that client, all we did was say, sell enough land to the payments, sell land at 50% of fair market value over 20 years at no interest. The same money of rent will be to land ownership. Use your capital gains deduction, pay no tax. So in other words, what we're doing is parents, instead of receiving land rent, are selling land prior to their death, paying no income tax whatsoever on the sale of land by using their capital gains deduction. So now, what have we done? We've saved 22% of the cash flow in taxes on that strategy. The son and daughter-in-law got to pick what land they really wanted to own at this present time. So of the 5 quarters, they bought 2. Mom and dad retained 3, and therefore, here's the important part. Once you transfer land when you're alive, the equity increase belongs to the owner. So one of the things on land, I really want to get clear on this point. If you're going to hold the land and not sell it when you're alive, if I'm going to make farming my career choice, we have to have this conversation. Does the land inflation that mom and dad continue to own forever, does the land inflation belong to them, or does part of the land inflation belongs to me because they were reluctant to transfer it because of the 5 Ds, which Annessa will bring up in a few moments. But what I want to get across is, yes, you own the land. Legally, you have the right to the inflation. But if I wasn't there to help you for the last 30 years, how much of that land inflation would not have went to you because you wouldn't have farmed and sold it? So what I'm trying to get across is on this concept of estate planning and wealth transfers. Just because you own it doesn't mean you have a moral right to own all the equity. And there's another discussion. It's called heritage equity. The equity, the land that mom and dad had paid for prior to me coming home, and I'll do my own situation. The equity that mom and dad created prior to me making the commitment to come home full time, that is their equity. They can do what they want with it. They can leave it to my sister, leave it to my brothers. I don't care. That's their equity. But my question is, the land equity inflation, how much of that belongs to the business, or how much of that belongs to the ability for them to give to other children? That's another discussion.
And the expansion.
And the expansion.
Right?
Yeah. So just the whole idea is just accountants are bad on this. We look at a balance sheet and say that's what the parents own. And what I'm saying is no. The tradition of that, we need to talk about heritage equity, purchased equity, and then equity that as inflation of equity. So another whole talk, Tracy. But what I want to get across is really to understand that if you do transfer land when you're alive, the issue of the land going up in inflation, like if I would have transferred a quarter to Annessa 10 years ago, land has doubled in Cremona in 10 years. So in those 10 years of doubling, no, you can't have it. But in those 10 years, if it would have doubled, she now owns that equity, correct?
Yeah.
If I keep it all to myself, then I own it all. And so that's a discussion we have to have about moving land earlier. And the reason why I will not do it as a parent is because of the
5Ds.
So Annessa, you go ahead and explain those.
But I think just before we jump into 5Ds, that's always something, the fair versus equal ultimately comes up, Tracy, when parents are trying to write this will, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But, that first challenge, like Dad alluded to, that number that's on the books from the accountant, who says that's the value we need to use, right? Like, that's my first challenge to parents is what value are you using for that conversation at all? If it's fair market value, or is it productive value? Because at the farm child, I will only ever see the productive value unless I sell it, right? And so that also just causes a huge breath of stress to exhale when we say, okay, we're knocking that down by hundreds of thousands of dollars, and now we're starting to assess again on our fair versus equal. So the 5Ds, this kind of derived over time of Dad and I working together and, trying to say the junior generation super frustrated because we're creating sandwiches of parents not transferring. And, I'm dealing with clients right now that are very proactive and stuff, but they're like, I'm not ready to transfer because I just got it at 75. Like, I want to own it a year before we talk about, going to the next. So first D of why parents are concerned, and I try to relay this to the junior generation to help their anxiety a bit, is of course divorce. It's not rocket science, right? That's one of the only benefits, I guess, of these crazy land prices, is that the increase that's part of the matrimonial, obviously that changes per province, but still, it's not increasing by hundreds of thousands of dollars at least anymore. Disposition is just a fancy word for sell. So that's our second D. So dad and mom transfer that quarter to me. If there's no control mechanisms in place, I can turn around and flip it. I'm pretty sure I'll be haunted for the rest of my life, but still there.
Not haunted, hunted.
Yeah, hunted while he's alive, and then haunted for sure. And then the third D, which a lot of parents have concern about as well, because in my generation, we haven't seen as hard times economically, so debt, right? If land is transferred to me at less than fair market value, I can still go and risk it, right? Put a lot to debt onto that. And then the fourth D, we certainly don't talk about enough, and it's death. But what if the child dies first? So that's certainly something that clams up as well. Does it now go to my partner, and can he do whatever he wants with it? Have we lost that land equity? That's a big freezing moment. And then for me to speak to dad, I'm saying, okay, that's a long list of legitimate concerns that we can now talk about. But what about mom and dad, dementia, disease, disability? What happens when you are cognitively not you? And unfortunately, we all know of those families in our communities too. That
it's happening now. You're driving me crazy.
I know. One day at a time.
You'd almost think that you guys are related or something. I'm just getting this small sense.
A little bit.
Yeah.
And so I just find, again, how do we structure the conversation? These are scary things. If, you were able to get those 5 Ds, sit down and kind of say, okay, mom and dad, what's your feelings on these? Now we've talked to our accountant and got some insight on, what can we do from there? And then, in our will for lawyers, here's their advice on ABCD, right? Trying to help structure that conversation.
So to kind of whet your audience's appetite for further conferences, Tracy, your podcast, is we have ways to, I will transfer as a parent to my children. None of my clients don't want to transfer wealth to the next generation, but they want to control it. So when we talk about they're scared. So these 5 Ds, we can't do it today, but there's ways to actually transfer this property and control it, but transfer the equity. And so that'll be another day we can talk about control mechanisms to allow me to, I may transfer land to Annessa someday, but I'm going to make damn sure I control it by understanding agreements so that she can't flip it, she can't mortgage it, she can't lose it, right? For maybe for the next 10 years, so she can't flip it or do those kind of things. I will do that then, as long as I have control. And there's different ways to do it.
And that's a very interesting, dad always comes across like he has a hammer for sure. And, it's just mom and I know how to be the neck for sure. But it's that mentality of, it's very interesting speaking to other advisors that certainly, push, if you are not willing to transfer land without any mechanisms or control mechanisms you want to call that, you shouldn't transfer. That's kind of something that's also in the industry. And it's very interesting speaking to the junior generation, and they say, as long as it's not just a hammer down and we have clear conversation about what these mechanisms are and the implications to both sides, absolutely, that's a mediation tool that we can meet in the middle, right? When dad says can't put debt on it and stuff like that, that's one of the big things. Here's a mechanism that prevents that. But if the family goal is the junior generation is going to use that gifted quarter for security to go get the next one, let's adjust it. Let's not put that mechanism on that quarter, right? And boom, all of a sudden we're having amazing communications around the table that are bringing up a bunch of things. So
clever. I have a whole list. Somebody needs to be taking notes here on our future episodes. I'll go back and watch.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Okay, well, that's good stuff. So where are we here? We have our list of things we wanted to cover today. Fiscal reality, transferring land. Where do we want to go, guys?
Well, I want to end up probably from this area of estate planning is I'm going to talk about land going to non-farm children. Okay. In my client base, I spoke at Farm Tech 10 years ago and won an award then. And I asked the audience, there was 1,500 people in the room. At that time, we had clickers to vote. I said, in your current will, in the room today, 1,500 farmers, what % of you are leaving land in your current will to non-active farm children? So I'm going to ask your audience this, pretend if I was talking to them, and I'm going to ask you, because we haven't rehearsed this one at all. So Tracy, what % of farmers that are listening to this podcast that are 65 years old are leaving land, some of their land based to non-farm active children? What %?
Oh boy, gosh, put me on the spot. I want to almost go all of them, 75, 80%, like it's going to be a high number.
It was 87% 10 years ago. It's probably 95% now. They will. And the reason why that is, even though they want to have the wealth, they act. So what I'm trying to get across is this terminology. You don't have to own it to have a successful business, but you have to have access to it. Mm-hmm. So in our wills, what we normally do, instead of fighting that decision, it's not the wrong decision to leave land to a non-farm child, because if we left it all to I want to reiterate this, we left it all to the farm business, which happens to be one child. When I say leave it to the child, I don't like that. I'm leaving it to the business, which happens to be one child. Like that's, but anyways. Language. But if we do that, if that child, somebody in the next 2 generations doesn't farm, it's what I'm finding, Tracy, it's not the fight between the siblings of wealth. It's the understanding that if their brother, who is the farmer, he gets $6 million of land, which is only 6 quarters or Corona now, or 5.5, if that family ever quits farming, their children and their children's children will be set up for life. It's no longer the controversy between 60-year-olds. Like it's not that, or 55-year-old siblings from the 80-year-old parents, or the 40-year-old siblings from the 65-year-old parents. That's not the issue anymore. Because most people in my generation, and guys that are over their 40 have had a pretty good go in Canada. It's the issue that if he ever sells it, that family is wealthy forever, and how many farms go past 100 years. I mean, that's the main issue that no one talks about, is the consequence of the second or third generation. So when you bring that consequence up, the first thing the farming son says, I'll never sell. And I say, well, you can never say never, right? So anyways, what we're looking at is the vast majority of people will leave some land to an off-farm child. And all I want to end with that is access agreements. So if I leave land to an off-farm child, I want them to be landlords. And I'll let Annessa speak about how we set that up in a will. So you go ahead, Annessa, and see how we do it technically in a will to have that access agreement. So go ahead.
Yeah, same conversation, and again, like we're tying them back, but that is because everything's webbed together, is again, fiscal reality. So if we have accepted that, yes, we are leaving land to off-farm children, again, are we projecting now what those land rental payments will be and things like that? Like that helps assess that equation. I also think it's kind of the prairie phenomenon, which my eyes were open to. And I'm a little different than Dad because we do work in a little bit different sectors of the province, where I'm starting to see this shift back now to say, we just recognize that not as much can go to the off-farm children because this is just our true fiscal reality. But it was shocking to me, speaking to my colleagues now being on a national team, that, they have 400-year-old farms down east. And I'm like, how does this happen? And it's, well, the culture is still the same. The business needs these assets. And that's the direction we go. Same with like supply chain managed, right? It's because we have this quilt pattern of land that we can easily say, okay, this $1 million of wealth goes to the off-farm brother, right? So just an interesting comment that has been fascinating to me now, being on a national team, that this division to off-farm children is part of the norm. But going back to leases, they're certainly not new. They're certainly not sexy. But what I fear causes more family harm than good is that they haven't been clear enough in expectations. Shocker. And so how do we pull that this agreement is going to be in the will, But when the family feels it's right, how do we bring this conversation to light before the will is read and have the siblings have this conversation while the natural referees, aka our parents, are alive? And so that's where a lot of parents I find are really jumping onto that, saying, we want to have the understanding that quarter A will be going to Susie and that we're having this conversation out so it's not the time of grief, that this awareness is coming to play. Now, as Dad and I mentioned earlier, it's a very strict timing. We don't want to have that conversation too early in case, plans change. And then Susie is very upset, or the off-farm brother is very upset. But in that lease agreement, we say specific number of years. So we've seen ones where it say, the off-farm brother has to rent to the business for as long as the other brother's farming. That's not clear. That's going to cause arguments and fights. Specific number of years. A caveat is filed against title to protect the farming business so that the off-farm sibling can't just pull the cord and sell the quarter. And also, what are we going to set the rate at? This is not a time to have the discussion of negotiation of rates when we're going through an intense time of grief, right? Mm-hmm. So I'll let Dad explain a little bit high level about how he's come up with a cool tool, a crop insurance index, because it's really hard to put a dollar value today when that will might not be read until 20 years. And now it's out of whack too, right? So kind of a proxy.
Good point. Okay.
Yeah, I think I'll skip that one because we only have, 5 minutes left or so.
Oh, we're okay. A little bit of time. You take it where you want to go.
Well, I'll do it very quick. Is what's interesting in just back to economics, cash rent in the prairies is roughly 20% of gross revenue. If you're grossing $500 an acre or 600, cash rent's between 95 and 110. It's kind of interesting just for your guys in economics. Canada's about 18 to 20% of gross revenue. The States is roughly 24 to 30. You imagine paying a third of your gross to cash rent. That's the reason why they can do that, believe it or not, is because of U.S. subsidies. So anyways, but that's an economic talk. But anyways, so that's what's interesting. If cash rent's roughly 20% of gross revenue in the growing, and that's on irrigated land as well, it's about 24%. So that's kind of a rough idea. Well, it's interesting. I thought about this about 10 years ago. Well, then if you go to the Manitoba Crop Insurance Office and ask them what the beginning farmer margin is in your area, right? So let's assume it's $220 crop insurance and your cash rent is $50. So all we just use is a multiple of beginning farmer cash rent. But going back to the leases, when I do the leases, Annessa talked about that, it's actually in the will. Like I leave the Northwest 17 to my daughter, Susan, on the condition that she agrees to rent the land to her brother for, say, 7 years, right? 5 years, whatever, at this rate. So what that does is the worst tragedy, if we're going to leave land to a non-farm child, can you imagine if I left land to my daughter and she rented it to the neighbor rather than to her brother? So that's why we tie it up, right, that way. And then in addition, we also have options to purchase. So if the land is to be kept in the family, in those lease agreements, I also add an option clause that says if the daughter wishes to sell the land during the lease period, the farm business, aka her brother, has the option to acquire it at 75% of appraised value.
Okay.
Do never use replacement, never use right of first refusal. This is getting more technical perhaps, but I just want to make sure that what I'm going to get across is that you can leave land as a wealth asset to a non-farm child, but if your objective is, as Nessa said, to be patient investors. That's the question I want the parents to answer. If I leave a quarter to a non-farm child, do I want them to be a patient investor? They get the $16,000 cash rent from their brother, or are they allowed to sell it the next day and walk off with $800,000? So to put that in perspective, at Cremona, a quarter section rents for $16,000. So if my sister got a quarter for $800,000 and sold it, that's 50 years of cash rent immediately. Wow. Right? So those are the conversations I'm talking about is, if you give land to an off-farm child, I think I concur with that, and that's said in the quilt of agriculture, because we've got these large land bases. What is the expectations of that gift?
Yeah.
And have they been communicated?
Correct. So when Nessa talks about not telling Susie answer A or B, but I go back to parents and I say, yes, once you guys should have a conceptual talk. Conceptual talks are, if I leave land to a non-farm child, I haven't made that decision yet, but if I do, this is going to be the restrictions. And what's interesting, Tracy, I've had clients make that comment about concept, and I've had the off-farm children come back, and this is another talk, won't have time today, is to say, well, if that's what the context is going to be, if I get a quarter section, I have to rent it to my brother for 10 years. He gets to buy it at 75% of appraised value. Blah, blah,
during
blah,
the lease period only.
Period. 100% after that. He'll pay me over 15 years. All these things. I've had young person, ladies and men, say, I'll tell you what, give me a couple $100,000 today and I'm done with it. And that's this conversation of transformational wealth, which maybe we can end up with at the end of the conversation. I'll let Annessa talk on that. Because if you give the concept, then the person can say, well, I don't want that, right? I don't want that wealth. I'd rather have income because my career is based on income. I'd rather get $200,000 today than $1 million of land tied up for 20 years from now. So I'll let you talk about transformational wealth, Annessa.
Perfect. That's good.
Yeah, and just a comment there on the time of the lease period. You know, what you're really saying there is that time is for the farming child to acquire to be able to purchase it potentially off their siblings. So I have some parents that say, nope, it's 3 years, one crop cycle, right? And others that will say it's 10. And again, that all is why your will is a living document. If your children are in their 30s, maybe it's 10 years. If your children are in their 50s, maybe it's 2 years, maybe, you know, do we even have an agreement, those kind of things. But again, that proactive conversation is giving the farm child time to also know, holy Hannah, I'm going to have to be purchasing 2 quarters in the future off my siblings. I can't go and buy that neighbor's quarter right now. And that's the biggest thing I want to end on is parents don't talk about this. And then we get to this point in time and we're so overcapitalized and our payments for that future quarter are based off the land we have today that we're losing. And so we have the order wrong. The other thing, stressing to Dad's point there about not saying, quarter A goes to Susie. I've sat in on so many conversations and the pain and hurt because they were told the physical land location and it changed. And that just caused so much. So that's why we're very, very cautious with that. Transformational wealth, I'll let Dad speak on it from a parent's perspective to wrap up, but it's just, have we asked our children what they want? Potentially they want that income, as Dad's saying. But again, going back to that, numbers as the junior generation, if my parents were to gift me $100,000, I say, woohoo, that's not even like 1/8 of a new combine, right? I need the wealth of the land. Now, if I'm wearing my city hat and my parents gift me $100,000 and saying, thank you, that's a down payment on my house, right? So it's income versus wealth. Now, Dad, I'll let you finish it off with just the parents' perspective there.
Yeah, it's just a challenge. I call it the chicken will. What happens in these wills, accountants and lawyers, we write what the parents wish to see. And we'll see this, and I'll end with this, which is actually, it's sad, but it's actually a truism. The truism is, hey, mom and dad, son who's farming with them, can we go borrow $500,000 and loan $250,000 each to your 2 off-farm daughters today? The answer, 99.99%, is absolutely friggin' not. Can't do it. It's impossible. Then I read the will. In the event of my death, my son will buy off his sisters $4 million of land. I'm going, excuse me, if you can't raise $500,000 today, how in the hell is he supposed to pay off $4 million? And then Dad says, well, it's fair. And I go, yeah, it's fair, but it's a chicken will. It means you're not going to deal with fiscal reality. You're just kicking it down the can and hope the hell that he does it. And my first mentor in my business 37 years ago, Cal Bradley, I'll still give him credit, he always said to the parents, if your son can pay off $4 million and today's value, and you can't pay off $500,000, does that mean he's 8 times better farmer than you are? So, just trying to put it in perspective. And so what I say to parents sometimes is, if you look at what you're trying to accomplish, the family side versus the business side, with these low interest rates, what's so interesting with the capital gains deduction, there's no way when I say give your daughter $250,000 and the other daughter $250,000 when they're 36 years old in their marriages, they go, well, no, I can't afford that. I'm saying, no, you can't in cash flow, but you can with debt capital. To borrow a $500,000 over 27 years or 25 years with FCC and whatever the rates are is 1.5 times cash rent. So if I can buy land off my parents at 1.5 times cash rent to own it and have them take that capital, totally tax-free with the capital gains deduction, lend that to my two sisters today so they can enjoy and create their living and pay off their houses. And then what that all cascades down. If I can help a non-farm child, not with wealth 25 years from now, but with income today, by putting that debt on the business today, what that'll do is they can pay their house off, and that gives them cash flow to do what? Put money into an RESP for their kids. So what I'm going back to the parents, the parents and the brother who's farming is saying, slow down here. Let's think about this. Let's think about family dynamics and communication and how to get along. If you are willing to borrow $500,000 in the business today to help the non-farm siblings get ahead in their lives, you're also educating the children, right? So they have the ability to have off-farm careers. And thirdly is the money is coming from whom? Not the parents. It's coming from the business, which means the brother is taking the responsibility to help his sisters and brother who's not farming to accelerate their careers, just like mom and dad are helping the son or helping you and your husband today in accelerating their careers. So when I have this conversation, I have found that it's not, of course, let's do it tomorrow because there's always something to do. But I'm finding slowly, Tracy, that they're starting to realize with the low, or what I'm trying to get across is the brother, he's 40 years old or 35 or 40. He's got 30 years ahead. His son wants to come back farming. So having that spread over 20, 25 years is very little stress to the cash flow business to assist the kids with transformational wealth. That's why I call it transformational. It'll change their lives, right? Versus getting a quarter section 20 years from now that happens to have all these restrictions.
Interesting. That is a powerful concept. I like that. You guys are so smart.
Well, I've been doing this for a very long time. And of course, Annessa's answer was, in the joke to me one time, she says, yeah, you do that, Mom and Dad. Borrow $250,000 to help me out in my career. And by the way, give me the quarter section as a gift too.
You have to be prepared for that. Like, that's definitely.
All right. But anyways, it's a lot of information in this estate planning one. But I just wanted to make sure as a challenge to the audience is can have the talk with your parents as concepts. Okay. If you say it, I want or I need, that is where I will put my back up as a parent. I want them, younger people in this podcast listening in, is just go to your parents with concepts. And what's nice about a podcast or a lecture, you can say, it wasn't my idea. It's this goddamn guy called Good. He's saying this. What do you think, Mom and Dad? That's what I like about doing educational opportunities. It's you're using someone else's experience to bring in the question and to open up the dialogue.
That's a great idea. Wow, guys, that is amazing. Did you cover everything? Well, I'll take that back. We didn't cover everything we want to cover here, but our main highlight points, do you guys feel good in what we covered today?
Yeah, I think kind of just summing up what Dad was alluding to there. As I mentioned, right, it's that push and pull of, and I was listening to your previous transition conversations and they hit on it too, right? Which generation's going to lead this horse? Like who's going to, and I really stress there's no blanket answer. Everyone knows their own family dynamics, right? But, from the junior generation, if you come up with proposals, not the proposal, but proposals, then the parents get to feel that they have their input into it, right? And then we can start to create our plan. If you're on the other end of the spectrum, my challenge is to the parents and say, if you're going to shut down every plan that the junior generation or proposal brings, you have to do the proposals to the junior generation and we work together. But just a concept there, we'll work together to make this plan with our advisors.
Lovely. That was great, guys.
So my ending conclusion is it takes a hell of a long time, but at the end of the day, it's worth it.
Amen. I don't think we could sum it up better than that, guys. Thank you so much for your time. I know we could probably do 2-day seminars right here and still just kind of hit the surface, but this was some really good, like we got our teeth into this here, and you guys gave some good actionable items. So I really enjoyed that there. I'm even going to go back and re-listen to these episodes because there was a lot of good stuff in here. So thank you. And I'll do one last call out. If people, I know Merle, you are just doing educational opportunities, like you said in the last episode.
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll see you back on the show. And Annessa, same goes to you. If anybody wants to get in touch with you, and I'll give a shout out to the FCC transition team, how do they go about doing that?
Yeah, for sure. So spread out across the country. So whether you're an FCC customer or not, you will call in, say you'd like to speak with a transition advisor for your area, and they'll be more than happy to work with you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you a million times over, guys. And thank you in the audience. I'm so speechless, I can't even say it. Thank you guys for tuning in for another episode. And if you love these episodes as much as I did, like it, share it, and get it out there. Every single farmer needs to hear this. So please do share it out. I'd really appreciate that. Thank you guys, and thank you in the audience. See you next week. Bye-bye.
You silence the doubters. You get the best tools. You work with the right people. You look to the future and bust through.
You've been listening to Impact Farming. For more great episodes and articles designed to help you manage and grow your farming operation, head on over to farmmarketer.com. Don't forget to sign up while you're there. We will see you on the next episode.